Welcome back to Accounting Matters, the podcast where we explore the issues that keep CFOs, controllers, and finance leaders up at night. I'm Adam Olsen, Embark's National Head of Practices, and today we're diving into the world of governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC, as we all like to know it. And joining me on the podcast today, a recurring guest, I would say. It's been a minute, but she's back. Allison Bradshaw, a principal at Embark who helps lead our GRC and internal audit services. Allison, welcome back.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be back here.
Yeah. So we're starting off our GRC series, kind of diving into kind of the entry point of internal audit, I'll say. And I think it's perfect timing because if we think about the risk landscape, it really has fundamentally changed in recent years.
Absolutely.
Right? Companies are dealing with cyber threats that didn't exist 10 years ago, right? The evolving landscape, we've got AI systems deploying faster than we can keep up with, it feels like sometimes, and really even keeping up with trying to govern them, right? And the increasingly just complex third-party ecosystem. So the old kind of compliance, check-the-box model that I think a lot of people may still think of internal audit as doing just isn't cutting it anymore.
You're absolutely right, Adam. And really organizations that are still treating it as a compliance exercise are really missing a massive opportunity. We're seeing really a fundamental shift from internal audit becoming a true strategic partner to the CFO, to the board, and to the organization at whole. But to get there, certainly you have to completely rethink what internal audit is, how it operates, and really embed it as part of the work that they do every day.
Yeah, and that's what we're really going to try to unpack here today. So really how internal audit moves from beyond compliance to becoming a real value driver at organizations. And also when it makes sense, right, to maybe outsource or co-source that role. And also then we'll talk a bit here about how just AI in general is transforming the field and really how CFOs can also kind of measure that return on investment as it relates to internal audit.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start with the big picture around the evolution of internal audit. So when you talk to CFOs or audit committees about internal audit, what's the disconnect you're typically seeing between where they are and where they could be?
Yeah, I think the biggest disconnect that I see most often is that organizations are running internal audit like it's, say, 2010, right? Sarbanes-Oxley was such a big transformative thing in the internal audit space. And so many are just solely focused on SOX compliance testing, financial controls, and producing reports that basically say, we tested it, all good, ready to go. And that's certainly table stakes, right? But if that's all you're doing, you're missing so much, you're leaving so much on the table, and you're missing really great opportunities to team with the rest of your organization to add value throughout it.
Yeah, and I think that's well said, and it's really resonates, I think, with a lot of conversations I know our teams are having with CFOs and clients and the like, right? I think it's kind of an interesting tension between, boards are really starting to ask hard questions about risk management, cybersecurity, operational resilience. And meanwhile, the CFO is sitting around here thinking, my internal audit team is already maxed out just dealing with regular Sarbanes-Oxley compliance stuff. So there's a real gap between, I think, even like board expectations and really what internal audit has the capacity to do. So what does that missed value then actually look like?
You have to think about what CFOs are worried about today, and you just touched on it there. But they're concerned about AI. They're concerned about cybersecurity risks and exposure that the company might have, risks for third-party relationships, whether that's sustainability focused or otherwise, right? Digital transformation initiatives going sideways, right? As that continues to accelerate for most companies. The list kind of goes on, but internal audit should be at the forefront of a lot of those changes and providing insights and assurance over those areas as they come, right? And that includes not just testing and confirming, but also being a part of the risk assessment and determining the risk appetite and kind of governance structure that goes over some of those things as well.
Yeah, so it's definitely more forward-looking and risk-based rather than just kind of looking back on like what was done from a client's or compliance perspective.
No, that's exactly right. And it's a meaningful shift in internal audit where everything was looking backwards. Everything, I often used to say, by the time you finish your audit work, everyone's moved on and you're 3 months later, right? Now we have an opportunity to really be a part of the forward-looking solution and really preventing problems before they happen in a real meaningful way, not just finding them after the fact and being the one to kind of raise the flag and say something went wrong in the past.
Yeah, but I can imagine too, there's also, right, we talked about capacity, so a resource challenge here, right? So most internal audit teams we've kind of highlighted are stretched pretty thin, just keeping up, even just compliance being a big undertaking for them, that eats up a lot of their time. So adding on all these other things that we're really needing these teams to help support, how can, if I'm a CFO or I'm a company trying to figure out how to best utilize my internal audit team to do multiple things, like how do they make this shift to cover all these areas without just doubling the headcount and the cost of that headcount?
Yeah, and that's exactly the challenge, right? Internal audit groups are being asked to do more with less on a continuous basis. Because of that, we're seeing more and more organizations look for alternative delivery options. And so what that includes are things like outsourcing completely or co-sourcing, because surprisingly enough, it can often be a more efficient, more effective way to not just get very pointed and direct knowledge and insight, but also it can be more efficient and more effective from a cost perspective as well. But before we get into that, I really think it's worth taking a look at what kind of a modern value-driven internal audit function can look like.
Let's spend some time on that then. So, and I do want to add something here. I think CFOs are facing broader talent challenges right now. It's not just internal audit, right? Probably across their entire team and in multiple areas within the finance function itself. I think there's a challenge for resources for sure. And, I think the skills that got us here won't necessarily get us where we need to go. Companies are needing people who can understand data analytics, for example, who can think about cyber risk, who can challenge business on strategy decisions as well. That's, a much different profile than traditional kind of auditors that we were kind of used to in the past, right? So, and I think it's harder to recruit and find those people as well. So paint that picture for us. What does then a modern internal audit function look like these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex question, but certainly at its highest level, first, it's still risk-based, right? And that's always been true. The audit plan is driven by what actually keeps executives up at night, not just a rotation schedule or kind of a check the box in terms of what that looks like. Second, and this is newer, it's more technologically enabled. And that means analytics that you talked about, automation, whether it's RPM or automating the actual testing itself, to broader populations and helping kind of identify those anomalies faster, as well as really, we'll get into this in a little bit, the continuous monitoring aspect of what technology can assist with as well. And then finally, it's consultative, right? It's not just checking the box and doing what's needed to be done from a compliance and a requirement perspective, but it's really partnering with management and the rest of the business to understand root causes and develop practical, tactical solutions that help advance the whole organization and not just a compliance function.
Yeah, and I think that last piece there, right, that's the most critical, right? Like the best internal audit professionals, really, they kind of act like translators at the companies, right? They can talk controls and risks with technical teams, but they can also sit in those executive meetings and explain maybe why something matters in business terms. And I think that ability and that skill set is rare and very valuable to the organization.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages of bringing in external parties, right? It's really difficult to build internal audit groups that have every niche skill set and perspective that you really need across an organization. So you get not just the independence and the objectivity of a third party, you also get an increased breadth of experience from what those organizations and those individuals see across their client base.
All right. Well, I think that then maybe pivots us into, we mentioned this on the kind of in the opening here, and the evolution of internal audit around outsourced internal audit and even co-sourced internal audit models. They might seem kind of straightforward in the terms themselves, but maybe just a level set here for our listeners and viewers here. Can you just walk through kind of what's the difference between the two approaches?
And I do think sometimes they're used interchangeably, but at its core, outsourcing is handing over the entire internal audit function and its responsibilities to an external provider. So they own the audit plan, they execute the work, they report to the audit committee and others across management, depending on whether you're talking about SOX and controls related work or risk focused work across the organization. Where co-sourcing is what it sounds like, it's more partnering, where you maintain an internal audit group and team to some extent, but you may bring in external resources to supplement, whether it's supplement capacity or skill set or specialized expertise, or to just handle specific projects so that you're freeing up your team to focus on risk-based projects or to focus on SOX, whatever that focus may be. So it can look very different from organization to organization.
And I guess with the clients you work with at Embark, are you kind of do you see both models being kind of utilized across the clients you serve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think bigger, more mature companies are generally more in the co-sourcing side of the house, where when you think about newer growing companies or, maybe private to public path, they're looking at sometimes outsourcing the full thing because hiring a full internal audit team to go from 0 to 3 to 4 people can be a significant cost for them.
Okay. And then what are some other just kind of signs in general, like if a company should start even just considering, maybe they haven't made the decision on outsource versus co-source, but even just thinking about one of those two options at all, like what are some of the kind of signs or trigger points you're seeing?
So I think the first is for existing internal audit teams, if they have capacity strains and kind of challenges on that front. So if your internal audit team is underwater, can't meet their deadlines, can't do everything that's being asked of them from others across the organization, they're not getting to that risk-based work that adds value, you should consider kind of using an external party to help there. Second, I think we've touched on it. It's really that expertise gap. So the biggest one that pops up to me is IT audit capabilities. With the changing world, changing risk landscape as it relates to IT, it's a real challenge to hire and maintain people in internal audit that have the skill set to kind of drive those initiatives forward. And so that's one we very commonly see kind of being pushed out to third parties. And it's often more cost effective and easier to do it that way. And the third is when companies are going through major transitions. And so think going from private to public and needing an enhancement of your internal audit group. So you're now needing to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley and have SOX-ready capabilities, post-merger integration work around controls. Another big one that we see is companies who shifting to shared service centers. So they're shifting their processes into new locations. And so they need an expertise to help do that in a meaningful way. And then I think the last is going through ERP system implementations where you always have to do a little of rethinking of your control environment and your control framework.
Yeah. And I know we touched on this a little bit when you're kind of talking around public companies, what model they might gravitate towards. But I guess maybe stepping back more broadly, like if I'm a company that's saying, okay, it sounds like I'm going to need some type of support in some capacity. I don't know yet if it's fully outsourced or maybe some co-sourcing opportunities here. Like, when does a company know which one makes more sense? And what are some of like the things that typically come up that would gravitate someone towards this versus the other?
Yeah, and I probably touched on it a little bit earlier, but full outsourcing generally works best for smaller organizations that run lean, that don't necessarily have the resources or desire to fully invest in a full-time internal audit team.
Yep.
So, for example, private equity portfolio companies often fit this profile. It can be effective approach as well when there's been a control breakdown and you need to kind of rebuild credibility quickly with an independent external team, right? And so those are kind of the primary situation where I think I've seen full outsourcing work really effectively. And sometimes it's cost optimization, right?
Yeah.
It's the total cost of in-house salaries, benefits, training, turnover versus outsourcing can be compelling, especially when you're getting more senior specialized resources. So I think about how we would staff a project. You're getting people with many years of experience, many years of exposure across different companies, and different industries. Whereas if you pull someone in-house, you got to find the right resource at the right level and then be using them in a way that excites and motivates them to stay.
Yeah, I guess one other thing I would probably add is, you mentioned just kind of the expertise and the quicker access to some of those resources by co-sourcing or outsourcing that role versus trying to find it internally. But I think in addition to just the experience and kind of the skills, you also have more flexibility with how you maybe use that resource.
100%. We're able to kind of ramp up, ramp down as needed, which can help save costs throughout the year, right? There may be periods where it's more intense, more costly, but then there's times where there's less going on, less activity, and then obviously you're saving on salaries, benefits, and all those things.
Right. So even if the external hourly rate's higher, right, you aren't eating the cost of all the downtime and stuff that may happen throughout the year versus using a full-time employee of your own. All right, let's segue off that flexibility kind of point that was raised here and really kind of connect that to a broader trend. And I think that's around finance teams really becoming orchestrators at their organizations, right? They are the ones that kind of are making that decision on when to build versus buy or partner, right? So kind of tying this back to our co-source or outsourced models. But can you maybe give an example of that situation?
Yeah, certainly. So for example, a mid-market public company might have 2 full-time auditors who sit on their internal audit team internally, handling coordination, audit committee communications, routine discussions with management around risk, that sort of thing. And then during, think of your SOX heavy times, during interim, final, they might bring in a team of 4 to 5 people to just really help get through the SOX testing and push through that and get it done timely, efficiently, effectively for them and external auditors as well. And then on the IT side, they might bring in a cybersecurity expert to do an assessment in Q1 or to evaluate what that looks like, right? Comparatively, you have a team of 2 being supported and enhanced by external providers in other areas versus having a full internal team that has to do all of that.
Yeah, so just kind of scaling into that expertise when it's needed, but recognizing you don't need it 365 days.
Exactly.
So so that makes a ton of sense. And I imagine, some CFOs worry about also knowledge transfer or loss of institutional knowledge when they work with external partners. I'm sure you maybe hear that come up as you're trying to explain the opportunity to CFOs, but how do you approach that concern? How do you address the idea that, hey, we may lose some of this institutional knowledge or efficiencies by working with a fully integrated, W-2 employee versus bringing in outside support?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern for management to think through. And that's why really the model and the partner that you choose matters a lot, right? So with pure outsourcing, you need to make sure the provider's documenting everything thoroughly and building continuity into the engagement, not rotating people in and out every few months.
Right.
With co-sourcing, you're inherently building institutional knowledge with your internal team. But I'd say this, one of the benefits of external partners is that they don't have that institutional knowledge, right? I think it's real easy in an internal audit group to get
We've always done it this way.
Yeah, exactly. Get comfortable with how things have been done and bringing in an outside perspective to really challenge and provide different perspectives on that can be incredibly valuable to an organization.
All right. So before we move on here, are there any other kind of decision factors CFOs should consider when they're thinking through kind of the co-sourced or outsourced models?
Yeah, I think there's 2 additional things I would add to that discussion. The first being independence and objectivity. As we know, it's really the cornerstone of any audit, whether internal or external. And if you need true independent assurance, maybe because of regulatory requirements or because the audit committee wants an unbiased view, external providers can be a very real tool to help accomplish that, right? And they provide it kind of naturally just within the structure. They don't have internal politics or career considerations kind of driving their findings or the results of that. The second is really the speed of deployment. You touched on this earlier, but if you need to stand up IA capabilities quickly, outsourcing and co-sourcing can get you operational in weeks or months versus a full year if you have to recruit get talent involved, hire, build a team, do all of the things required to do that internally. And so I really think time constraints and speed of deployment are one of the biggest advantages to looking external to help build an internal audit group.
All right. So now that we've talked about the different models that potentially exist for how companies might staff and pull in some internal audit resources, let's go ahead and shift the conversation a bit to talk about how all of this work is getting done and kind of that transformation in the way it's getting done, right? You really can't have a conversation about the future of internal audit without talking about technology, artificial intelligence, automation, data analytics, all the things all the buzzwords these days, right? And I do want to frame this with an observation, right? I think a lot of CFOs we're talking to are already thinking about digital transformation somewhere in their organization. They're either implementing new ERPs or other AI tools or softwares, and they're automating processes throughout the organization as a whole. But I'm not always sure that they're thinking about how internal audit also needs to transform at the same pace. Is that fair?
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's such really an important framing of it, right? Because internal audit can't be the function that is stuck in the past while the rest of the organization is racing forward with technology. The role that it plays is too important and too critical to be left behind in really kind of the technology race that companies are experiencing right now. But often with budget and resource constraints, that is in fact what is happening to internal audit groups in practice for a number of companies. But instead, really, those companies and internal audit groups need to fundamentally shift how audit work is being performed, and organizations that aren't adopting these tools, not just within the finance organization, but within internal audit as well, are going to really fall behind quickly and, quite frankly, have more challenges and problems that arise from the transformation that is going on through the rest of the organization. So I think if I were to kind of look at the technology space in a couple of different categories, I would start first with data analytics and continuous monitoring that you kind of touched on there. So traditionally, you think about how internal auditors would sample. They'd pick 25, 30 items that happened in the past year, and out of potentially thousands or millions of transactions, test them after the fact and kind of conclude. Right. Okay. Now with analytics, you can really test entire populations. You can actually see 100% of a class of transaction or of an account balance, and you can run scripts that analyze every invoice, every journal entry, every access log, looking for anomalies, outliers, and policy violations. That's a really, really powerful improvement in really just the coverage and extent of testing that's being performed by internal audit groups.
Yeah. So, I mean, to give it an analogy, right? Instead of trying to find that needle in the haystack and by randomly just pulling out pieces of hay, you're using analytics to identify really where the needles actually are.
Yeah. So analytics and monitoring can be your metal detector, right? Perfect analogy. So detective controls have always historically been a tool in the toolbox of internal audit to help create an effective control environment. So no surprises there. The problem is historically they've just been late to the party. They don't identify things timely. They're not able to truly kind of mitigate any risks that are being addressed when identified that late in the game with once-a-year testing, right? But analytics and monitoring is not just that lagging indicator of a control failure or an issue, but really a timely identification of challenges and issues where a process may have gone wrong. And that's really, really powerful. We can, quite frankly, set up monitoring routines to be done on a quarterly, monthly, even weekly basis. So flagging those issues near real time as possible, so management can respond faster. That's a huge shift from the traditional model where you might find the issue 6 months, 9 months after it actually happened.
Yeah, and that's pretty impactful, right?
Totally.
All right, so let's then maybe segue into artificial intelligence specifically. Yeah. We're hearing clients talk more about it, and we talk about it a lot as a firm. Everyone, frankly, is talking about AI in some capacity. How are you, though, seeing artificial intelligence kind of applied to what internal audit is doing?
Yeah, it's showing up in several ways, as I think it is across a broad dissection of organizations, but one is really in the document review and analysis. So let's say you're reviewing contracts for compliance with revenue recognition standards. AI can help review thousands of contracts, extract key terms, kind of flag potential issues within contracts far faster than an individual kind of combing through hundreds, thousands of pages of contract documents can, right? We're also seeing AI used for fraud detection. So machine learning models can identify patterns of fraudulent behavior that humans might miss, right? And you can prompt those machine learning tools to try a number of different things a lot quicker and more effectively than you could do that manually, right? Another big area where we're seeing a huge shift in AI and reliance on AI is in the risk assessment itself. And so AI can analyze unstructured data, emails, chat messages, external information from an industry perspective, news articles, social media, world's your oyster,
right?
To identify emerging risks that might not otherwise show up in the traditional risk assessment process. And that's a really important, powerful tool, if not to identify current risks, but certainly emerging risks are more easily identified that way as well.
So it's doing a lot, is what it sounds like. We're seeing AI all over across different areas of the internal audit role and function.
That's just in internal audit.
Right.
That's putting aside what's happening across the organization from an AI perspective.
So let me, not to be doom and gloom here, but like I feel like we all kind of have these conversations, right? But it's doing so much, or has the ability to do so much of what historically, humans in that role were doing. Does that put internal auditors at risk of, is their job still relevant? Like, should internal audit professionals, are they worried about how AI is going to impact or evolve the traditional capacity of what their role looks like?
Yeah, I mean, we see it as
everyone's
this
is applicable, right? I think any industry, any role, everyone's kind of like playing that little fear factor kind of narrative in a way.
Absolutely, but I think it's more a function of how roles are evolving, right? And in my mind, it's evolving in a very positive value add way, because really what is happening is technology is handling the repetitive high volume testing work. Right. What it doesn't do is apply professional judgment and really that lens to both the process and the results, right? It still needs to be told what to do, how to consider, what not to consider. And so really what we're seeing is that technology is freeing up auditors to do that value added work, more root cause analysis, more advisory work on how to actually improve a process, make it more efficient, more effective, more strategic work that kind of feeds into the larger business on the whole. The skill set is shifting from can you execute a well-designed test to can you design the right test, interpret those results, and then drive meaningful change within the organization because of the results of that test.
Right. Yeah, that the AI is not going to always apply the right level of business context. They're not the ones having the challenging conversations with members of management within the organization. So there's obviously still a lot of value in the way kind of internal audit's role is kind of evolving, like you said.
That's right.
All right, let me ask you something, since we just spent the last few minutes kind of talking about the impacts of AI, just specific to internal audit, but if I think more broadly across, an organization, it's touching probably every area in some capacity, right? How does the introduction of all these new technologies and changes in roles and processes and things like that, like, I assume it's introducing more risk into the organization itself by the introduction of these tools and things?
Yeah, I mean, despite the huge benefits and efficiencies and gains that come from technology, the ironic thing is the technology itself is a risk area. So one of the fastest growing areas of internal audit is really the IT side, as well as cybersecurity. It comes up time and time again as top of mind for boards and C-team level management across every organization that I work with.
Yep.
And organizations are asking, are our AI systems operating as intended? Are we getting false results? Are we getting hallucinations from AI that are leading us to the incorrect answers, right? Do we have appropriate controls around our AI models? Are we monitoring for bias or errors? So these are all real questions that today's internal audit functions need to be able to answer.
So speaking of AI and controls, it really is kind of like a double-edged sword if we think about it, right? You got AI is necessary, I think, to efficiently do some of the auditing procedures and some of the things that internal audit needs to get accomplished during the year. But then in and of itself, that tool also needs to be audited. And I think, like you said, it's one of the biggest conversations that you're hearing boards talk about. It's a top priority for boards. It's been a top priority, I think, for a number of years, and it's going to continue to grow as we see more and more evolution into this space. And I think a lot of boards are asking the questions of like, hey, are we moving fast enough as an organization when it comes to the use of AI? What are our competitors doing? How are we staying current? But in the same vein, they're also asking, are we moving too fast? Like, are we getting ahead of ourselves before we have the right processes, controls, and oversight and governance, instilled within the organization? So, I think it's something that everyone's obviously excited about the potential of it, but again, there's a lot of anxiety around the risks. So how is internal audit then thinking through that kind of board scenario and those board kind of concerns?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important emerging areas in GRC, right? The tension that you're describing is exactly what we're seeing. And I have clients kind of on both ends of the spectrum, some pedal to the metal, gas to the floorboard, others slamming on the brakes, saying, stop, let's figure out how to govern and control this in a meaningful way, right? Some are deploying AI rapidly, whether it's in customer service, fraud detection, pricing models, in hiring decisions, quickly kind of moving ahead without the necessary kind of robust governance structures in place over AI, while others aren't allowing any AI at all, right? And in either case, internal audit really can and should play a key role in the technology transformation that is here, right? Internal audit needs to be asking questions like, what is the acceptable risk appetite as it relates to AI? Do we know where AI is being used throughout the organization? Have we assessed the risks properly? Are there appropriate controls around data quality, model validation, and monitoring? And that's just kind of scratching the surface of really kind of the questions around AI and how it's being used.
Yeah, and I think tying back to when we talked about the evolution of internal audit, it just seems like, again, this is a whole new type of skill set, right? That's necessary in this role versus kind of the normal traditional financial auditing function of internal audit.
Yeah, it does. And that's another reason to kind of bring us full circle to what we were talking about earlier, why organizations are turning to outsourcing and co-sourcing for aspects of this work, right? Building a team that has deep IT audit skills, cybersecurity expertise, data science capabilities, and traditional financial audit experience is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's much
expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And it's much more practical to maintain a core team and bring in specialized supplemental expertise as needed. At Embark, we've certainly invested heavily in building those capabilities around data analytics, IT risk and security, AI governance, so we can deploy them flexibly across clients. You don't have to hire a full-time AI governance specialist when you might only need that expertise a few times a year.
Yeah. What about the tools themselves? Are there technology platforms that internal audit function should be investing in? Are you seeing people invest in? And I ask this knowing that a lot of organizations, right? I think many of us kind of have tool fatigue right now. Companies have invested in platforms that promise the world. And, frankly, I think a lot of things we've seen kind of turned into uselessness or things that just didn't kind of live up to expectations. So how do you think about technology investment strategically, or how are you seeing internal audit teams think about that?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, there's really kind of the most basic audit management platforms, right? So those that can really just help you in the project management and execution of your internal audit function. So things like Workiva and Flowcast, I think, are really great examples of that. The second area is in analytics platforms, whether it's ACL, Alteryx, Power BI, process analytic tools are some of the kind of the more advanced ones. Sure. Having the ability to connect to source systems and analyze that data is really critical. And then I think the third is GRC platforms like some of the ones I talked about in the first piece, but that integrate risk management, compliance, and audit all together, right? So it gives you a big picture view of your organization and what it looks like at the governance level. And so again, those are tools like Workiva, Archer, ServiceNow, Logic Managers. They can create really that connected GRC ecosystem so that you're not operating in silos. So that's kind of a really important for large, big, mature companies as they kind of move forward. But also increasingly, we're seeing organizations adopt continuous monitoring tools that provide real-time dashboards on control effectiveness.
Yeah, and I would say, probably one of the benefits of partnering with somebody like Embark, where we can really provide value. I think it's because we've seen the use of these different tools and technology across lots of different organizations, lots of different sizes, industries, things like that. And we kind of know what actually works versus what maybe just becomes kind of expensive shelfware, right? I think one of the hidden costs, if I'm thinking about all the things that you mentioned, is that there's a lot of investment that goes into some of the internal audit support tools, and investing in the wrong technology stack and then having to kind of rip it out or start over again. All of that adds up. And so I think us being able to see this across multiple different types of environments is just a valuable insight that we can provide as companies are trying to navigate towards where to put those dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. We see this across dozens, hundreds of clients in different industries. We can help organizations make informed decisions about technology investments, help run RFPs, for instance, for tools in this space. And often we already have tools that we can deploy to them as part of our engagements and the work that we do with them. So the client doesn't have to make that upfront capital investment. So it can work both ways. They can essentially test drive the technology through our engagement before committing to a purchase.
All right, so let me kind of recap where we're at. We just walked through the evolution of internal audit. We talked about some of the alternative delivery models, just walked through the impacts of technology and AI in the way internal audit is transforming. But I think kind of the last piece of the conversation that I want to kind of swing to next is around, I think, one of the most important questions, and that's really about how do you actually measure the ROI of internal audit? How does the CFO justify this type of investment? And frankly, it's probably $1 million question here. And I do want to set this up with a bit more context, right? CFOs, they're obviously under a lot of pressure right now. I think you used the term as well, to do more with less. We hear that all the time, I would say, in conversations we're having with CFOs, right? Every budget cycle, they're being asked to justify every little investment, every dollar, every additional head that they want to add to teams. And internal audit, I think, often ends up in an awkward position where it's seen maybe as overhead and not true value creation, albeit unfairly. But that's kind of what I'm hearing and seeing, and I'm sure you hear some of the same anecdotes as well. That internal audit is just a cost center to an organization, and they think that's how people think about it initially, until the company gets blindsided, right, by fraud or some type of control issue, or external audit is going on, and there's all sorts of breakdowns that happen during the audit process. So the CFOs who get it right, though, I think they actually see internal audit as strategic risk intelligence. You kind of spoke to this earlier here. So help us make that case for the ones that maybe aren't there about the value of internal audit. How do you actually measure the ROI of internal audit and really help CFOs think about it more than just some type of compliance function within the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've laid out the challenge pretty well there. This is where a lot of internal audit functions struggle, because they're not thinking about or communicating their value in business terms, right? So let me give you a framework in how to think about internal audit ROI. So first, I think there's prevented costs. Okay. So these are a little bit harder to measure because you're quantifying something that didn't or hasn't happened, but they're real, right? So you touched on kind of some of the fraud challenges or things that can happen when you don't invest and you don't pay attention. But if internal audit identifies a control weakness that could have led to a material misstatement, for instance, or a fraud scheme before a significant loss occurs, or a cybersecurity vulnerability before a breach, that's real value to the organization, right? You can estimate the cost of what was prevented there in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so it's kind of like insurance,
Yeah.
maybe, right? You hope you never have to really use it, but you're glad that you have it when you need it, right?
That's exactly right. So then I think the second is really in recovered value, right? So this is a little bit easier to measure. This is if, your internal audit group identifies billing errors, payment leakage, uncollected revenue, fraudulent transaction, that sort of thing. You can often very quickly quantify the exact dollar amount recovered or corrected with those findings. And so we've had engagements where every single finding identified, or a single finding, identified millions in revenue leakage or kind of procurement fraud. Third is really process improvements and efficiency gains. So when internal audit isn't just finding control issues, but also identifying operational inefficiencies, you can measure the cost savings or productivity improvements in hours or days or, whatever the measurement of unit of measurement might be. Potentially maybe internal audit identifies a manual reconciliation process that could be automated, saving 200 hours per month, for instance. That's quantifiable, and that's real value to the business, real cost savings to the organization.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, I think those are all pretty tangible things that we can point to, but are there any kind of less tangible benefits that I think CFOs should also keep in mind as they're thinking about ROI?
Certainly. I think the less tangible benefits are related to risk reduction and really stakeholder confidence, right? Yep. Both of which are very important to an organization. If you're a public company, having a robust internal audit function can positively impact your audit fees because your external auditors have more comfort in your control environment. It can impact your cost of capital because investors and lenders have more confidence in your financial reporting and governance. For private equity-backed companies, a strong internal audit function can be value creation lever that makes the company more attractive for exit. Buyers want to see mature controls and governance so that they have that confidence in the performance itself.
Yeah, so tons of also less tangible things, but just equally valuable. If you're thinking about ways to kind of measure and track that internal audit value, are there certain metrics that organizations are using to help kind of have like a benchmark against some of the ROI we're talking about here?
Yeah, and I think the specific metrics look different from organization to organization, but I would recommend really a balanced scorecard approach. So you want quantitative metrics like number of audits completed, percentage of high-risk audit areas covered, findings issued, remediated, dollar amounts of prevented or recovered losses, management satisfaction scores, and audit committee satisfaction scores. But you also want qualitative indicators. Are we getting invited to strategic conversations early? Are we seen as trusted advisors? Are our recommendations being implemented across the business, right? Sure. Are we providing insights that are shaping decision making? Those are really kind of the qualitative indicators that your organization is providing real value to the business.
Yeah, so a mix of both there. How is kind of that ROI? Does the conversation, I guess, we talked about co-sourcing and outsourcing alternative approaches to internal audit. Does the ROI conversation change when you're thinking about co-sourcing or outsourced?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes with outsourcing or co-sourcing, you can often demonstrate the ROI more explicitly because you're comparing a defined cost, the engagement fee, against a measurable outcome. So let me give you kind of a real example. I had a client where they were a mid-market retailer where we implemented a co-source model. Their previous internal audit function was 2 full-time employees costing about $250,000 annually in salary and benefits. And they were able to complete about 6 audits per year, mostly focused purely on SOX compliance. They were getting pressure from the audit committee to do more risk-based work, but they didn't have any capacity to do so, right? So we came in with a co-source model at roughly the same annual cost, but we deployed senior level resources, used analytics, completed 12 audits per year, covering both compliance and strategic risk areas. And within the first year, our team was able to identify revenue leakage of around $1 million with a pricing system error that was identified and uncovered kind of vendor fraud scheme that would have cost them $500,000 annually. So very real ROI in that.
That's pretty impressive, right? Was that like a 8x return and just in year 1 there?
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty powerful if I say so myself. It's not just about theoretical ROI, it's actual cash that would have walked out the door in there. And, I think about this in terms of what keeps CFOs up at night as well. It's not usually, hey, did we complete our audit plan? It's more like, are we losing money and I don't know it, right?
Yeah.
Or is there a fraud happening that we're missing? Or are we compliant with regulations that could lead to fines that are millions of dollars if we screw something up here? Those are the questions really I think CFOs are asking, and a strong internal audit function, gives you that visibility and confidence on all of those fronts.
Yeah, exactly. And beyond just the hard dollar ROI, the audit committee has much higher confidence in the internal audit function. Management was getting more actionable insights, and the organization's overall risk posture really improved significantly.
Awesome. So any final thoughts on ROI before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the biggest mindset shift is moving from what does internal audit cost to what does not having an effective internal audit cost.
It's a good way to frame it.
The cost of a missed fraud, a compliance failure, a cybersecurity breach, which are happening more and more often, or a failed digital transformation because controls weren't considered. Those costs dwarf the investment in a strong internal audit function. The CFOs who get this right see internal audit as an investment in organizational resilience and sustainable growth, not just a compliance tool.
Yeah, and I would just add this, in today's environment, when we're dealing with economic uncertainty, regulatory complexity, the cyber threats you mentioned, all the rapid technological changes that we walked through earlier, the organizations that thrive are the ones that have strong risk intelligence and governance, right? Internal audit, obviously critical part of that infrastructure. It's not optional anymore, I think, in today's world. The only question is whether you're going to do it well or do it poorly, in my mind. And if you're going to do it well, you need the right model, you need that right technology in place, and you need the right expertise. So that brings us back to everything we've talked about today. So this has been a fantastic conversation, but I do want to go ahead and just maybe wrap up with some key takeaways. I think it's a good way to kind of put a bow in this for today for our listeners. So any key takeaways you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think if you're a CFO or a controller and you're thinking about your internal audit function, here are the questions that I would be asking.
Okay.
So first, is your internal audit truly risk-based? Or are you just checking a compliance box? Do you have the right capacity and expertise to cover your top enterprise risks, or are there gaps? Are you leveraging technology and data analytics, or are you still doing everything manually? Can you articulate the value and ROI of your internal audit function to your audit committee and stakeholders? And have you considered whether an outsource or co-source model might give you better outcomes at a comparable or lower cost?
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions to ask to really kind of just make you think a bit more about some of this stuff that we talked through today. But if someone's listening and they want to maybe explore and internal audit services, or just have a deeper conversation around maybe the co-sourcing or the outsourced models or some of the technological changes that we highlighted here, what should they do?
I mean, we'd love to have a conversation. Embark offers internal audit assessments where we can look at your current state, benchmark against your peers, and identify opportunities to enhance value. It's no obligation conversation. So, it doesn't cost anything to have that discussion, but it can often surface insights that organizations can find really, really valuable.
Awesome. Well, that is a great place to wrap this up. And I will also add for our listeners, we have a lot of great resources on our website. So definitely check that out at embarkwithus.com or connect directly with Allison herself. You can find her on LinkedIn. I'm sure she'd love to
Absolutely.
Continue the conversation there. So we will go ahead and wrap for today. Allison, I want to thank you again so much for joining me on kind of part one of this GRC series that we're kicking off here. I know we've got more topics and exciting things to talk about, all within kind of the ecosystem of GRC, but today was incredibly insightful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam. It was fun.
Awesome. And thanks again to our listeners for joining us, like I said, on our first episode in our GRC series. In the next episode, we're going to be talking a bit more about the modernization of GRC. So really how organizations are transforming their governance, risk, and compliance functions for the digital age, diving in deeper there, and you don't want to miss that. Until next time, you're listening to Accounting Matters. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you then.